Thank you for coming today, and welcome to the Royal Oak Schoolyard. Now, of course, in a schoolyard, we tell stories. And today we have Mike Lawrence joining us to tell some stories about growing up in the late 50s, early 60s in rural Saanich. So if we're going to tell stories, we need to have characters and a place and a time. So let's start with our characters, and our main character is Mike. Now, Mike, most people who attended Royal Oak School only knew you as Mike Brown,
right.
But now you're using Mike Lawrence. So can you just let people know how that came about?
Yeah, when we first came out to Royal Oak, my stepfather was named Brown, but I wasn't legally, legally adopted. So I went through all my Royal Oak days as Mike Brown, but when I hit 16, there was a lot of legalities involved, like driver's license and stuff like that. So I had to go to my legal name, which was Lawrence.
Thank you. Now, as for a time and a place, when did your family first come to Saanich?
It would be, when I was 8 years old, that would be 1951, and we lived in a house across, it was called East Saanich Road then, the highway, and we were across from the Beaver Lake exit. So we were there for just 1 year. And I went to that little school, I forget what they call it, but the little two-room school or one-room school.
Yeah.
For 1 year.
So that was before the Pat Bay Highway came through.
Oh, heck yeah, I can remember them cutting it through.
Yeah. And then, but then your family left for a while and then came back again?
Yeah.
Okay.
We moved out to Langford for only about a half a year, and then my family joined up with another family, and we bought a house on Viaduct Avenue. And subsequent to that, my dad, he bought out the other partner, and so the family just had, we were just single family then. And that was, we called it back then the third trestle. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but if I told somebody where I lived, I'd say the third trestle, and they knew what I was talking about. And back then, the old railway line was quite pronounced. It was still quite obvious cutting through there, out into urban. So I had to make new friends because I went to Strawberryville School until grade 6. And then when it came to go to grade 7, I thought I was going to Colquitt's. And they came along and said, no, you're on the wrong side of Viaduct, you're going to Royal Oak. And I had met a new group of friends, and among them Gary Quayle, who many people probably recognize the Quayle name, and another character named Robert Petrie. And his dad was director of the observatory at that time. And Robert was a bit of a screwball. He was very intelligent, but he was a screwball. One of his antics was we used to drive up to the observatory on a weekend night. One guy had a car, and we'd hang around up there, and when it was time to go, we'd all jump into the car, and Robert stayed there, and when the car took off, Robert took off down the mountain, running through, right down the mountain. And he always beat us, and when we got down to the bottom of the hill, he would be leaning against a tree, smoking a cigarette, real casual. And we could never beat him. So I think Susan remembers hearing the squeal of tires. And
Indeed I do. So Mike's 2.5 years older than I am. So when he was a wild buck tearing up and down in cars, I was tucked into bed and asleep by 9 o'clock at night. But remember, this is rural Saanich, and our house was on the east side of Observatory Mountain, Observatory Hill, and I can remember on a Saturday night hearing the squealing of tires coming down the hill. Now, if you had told me that I would wind up married to somebody in that car, would I have believed you? Never.
Well, I kept her awake a few other times too. When I was 15, I bought a motorcycle, and it wasn't in very good shape, but I fixed it right up so I could get 40 miles an hour out of it. But I had no lights, no brakes, of course no license, no driver's license, and no muffler. And I had a girlfriend over on Cordova Bay Heights, and I used to run over there at night and take all the back roads up interurban, across to Old West, down to Brookley, down Brookley to the highway, and then up to Cordova Bay Heights. But that thing made a bit of a racket. And the cops used to chase me once in a while. And I came out one day, going home again, got off Old West Road onto Saanich Road, and as I was turning onto interurban, I could see lights in the distance, and I realized it was a cop car. And I just booted as fast as I could go down interurban. I looked over my shoulder, and sure enough, they're following me. So I decided to ditch. Literally, I swung off onto a driveway that was gravel, and I was still going flat out. Skidded in the gravel, went onto my side and down into a ditch. It was a fairly deep ditch. And I'm lying there, and I can hear this cop car come up, and they stopped almost opposite me. And they sat there for 3 or 4 minutes. I guess they were listening for me. So, anyway, they took off, and I got home. And on Monday, I'm walking up the hill from Royal Oak School. There's a cop car sitting at the top of the hill. And I'm walking, and this cop, he leans out the window, and he says, "Hey, you, come here." So I went over there. And he says, "Was that you who were chasing Saturday night?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Where the hell did you get to anyway?" So I told him where I'd gotten to, and he said, "Yeah, we figured you were around there somewhere." But I rode that motorbike around quite a bit. And on Viaduct, going south, the hill comes down. It's fairly sharp to the little bridge there, and then a turn into our driveway. And I could never make it. So I used to go down that hill, up the other one, turn around, and then come back and into the driveway. And one afternoon I did that, and I come up the hill the other way. Here's a cop car coming. I wheeled around and went tearing down to the driveway, up the driveway, and we had a garage that was about that far off the level ground, a little ramp up. And I went tearing down the driveway, up the ramp, and boom, right into the wall. So I get this by mine on the ground, on the floor with his bike on top of me, and this cop car comes up the driveway. And he gets out, I got up, and he says, "Let's see your license." Of course, I'm only 15, I don't have one. I said, "Well, I don't have one." And he said, "Well, let's see your insurance." And I said, "I don't have that either." And he said, "I guess it would be asking too much for registration." So, he's almost smirking. You could see it on his face. And he says, "All right," he says, "next time I catch you out on this thing, I'm going to try it out." And he says, "If it's not in good shape, I'm going to pinch you." But I had no brakes. So anyway, where we lived there on Viaduct, there was the flats out on the other side of the road. And in those days, there was no beavers, and it didn't flood like it does now. It was just a creek running through it. And At that time, it was farmed by inmates from the Wilkinson Road Jail. They were all, excuse me, it was a jail for criminally insane at that time. And they used to come out and harvest peas and everything like that. And we go out there when they're driving out on their flat deck trucks, and throwing peas at us and potatoes and carrots or whatever. That all changed.
Just, he mentioned that when he had this bike, that he was also, I had heard it. Again, I can remember being in bed at night. And like I said, in those days, everything was quiet. But I can remember being in bed at night and hearing this thing come, and it had come around a corner. I remember, and again, I had no idea who was driving it. I didn't find out really until I suppose we were engaged or even married that it was him who was making all this racket as a kid. Yeah.
But that place on Viaduct was a wonderful place to live, and a creek went right through it. It was a tributary to the Colquitt's Creek. And in those days, the salmon and trout were just thick in that creek. I don't know what it's like now, but...
Nothing there now.
Nothing in there now? Oh, man, their coho salmon came up to spawn. Mm-hmm. There was literally hundreds. Yeah, they were great big things, 7, 8, 9 pounds.
Yeah. But you pretty much had the whole peninsula as your backyard.
Yep. Yeah.
With Gary.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a wonderful place for me to grow up because I like going out into the woods and hunting. I had an air rifle. I used to go out and I used to get the odd pheasant with this air rifle. I don't know if the pheasants are around much anymore or not, are they? No.
There was pheasants out there when we moved up in '76, but we haven't seen them since.
Yeah. Yeah, apparently they were brought over from China, and they didn't adapt themselves very well over here, you know, versus predators and that sort of thing. You know.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for Mike?
Well, he must have stories about doing his paper route. Oh yeah, the paper route. He was our paper boy.
Okay. You have been identified as the paper boy.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have some more stories about your paper routes?
Not really, no.
What about the story
No, it's just routine paper routes.
What about the story that you heard about the same individual and her lawnmower?
Oh, right. Harvey Sherman told me this when I was here last time. The woman that I spoke about, I said she was slightly eccentric, lived at the bottom of the Church Hill here. And Harvey told me this. He said he worked at a part-time at one of the Royal Oak garages. And one day, this woman comes up. She walked all the way from her home down to the Royal Oak, pushing this lawnmower. And she got it into the garage, and she complained she couldn't get it started. It was gas, of course. So I'm not sure who was the operator then, but he got it, gave it a pull, and it started. And so he shut it off and said, "There you go, there's nothing wrong with it." So she said, "Could you do it again?" So he started it up again. She said, "Thank you," and took off up the road with it running. She was heading home again with this bloody lawnmower running. So the garage operator, he jumped in his pickup and got a hold of her and took her home.
Probably Otto Wilner, the father, or Gary Wilner.
Pardon me?
Otto Wilner.
There, Gary.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Mike, was there a game farm when you first moved there, right across from the Beaver Lake?
Yeah, we were right next door to the warden.
The game farm.
Pardon me?
It was a game, all I remember, we were...
He's a game warden.
Game warden.
Yeah.
Game warden?
Yeah.
That was JoJo.
It was where the, I guess, the cemetery is now.
Yeah, they were right beside us. I mentioned Robert Petrie, whose dad was the director of the observatory. And like I said, he was a bit of a screwball. But we'd go up there, and he discovered a way to get into the dome. And we'd go up there, and there was one plate at the edge of the dome where it went around like that, and we could pull that plate open, crawl in, and then we're inside the dome. Of course, we didn't do any damage, but we wandered around the dome. We had to prove our courage, we had to go up to the viewing platform, which was quite a ways above the floor, maybe 30, 40 feet. That was scary. It was narrow and scary. So that's some of the things we did with Robert. And we used to get into the office building too. They had a ping pong table down the office building. We used to go down there and play ping pong. But we never damaged anything.
Were you delivering the paper Scarborough Road, right?
Yep.
Scarborough Road.
Yep.
Did my dad clear some brush so you could go directly down to Christensen's without having to go around?
I don't recall, but
Well, anyway, it's
quite
still
possible.
an open path. I don't know if it was you, or I'm thinking maybe the master's boy.
Oh.
You remember Robert Masters?
Or Jamie.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember the name.
Was he a
Yeah.
paper boy too? Don't know.
Oh. Rick?
That was about your story on the hill.
Yeah.
Okay. In 1951, Robert Petrie Sr.
Yeah.
became the director.
Yeah.
My dad was the director up until 1950, actually July 51, and we lived on the hill. So this trail that you talked to about beating the car down,
Yeah.
I used that trail every day to go to school, to come to Royal Oak School.
All right.
So it was built by the engineers because we had fires on the hill. Some of you will remember in the 40s and 50s, there were devastating fires that took off a lot of timber. And so the Army was stationed on the hill for a while, a contingent, in case there was another one. But the engineers built this trail that you speak of. And it went from the office building just below the hill, right? Through the woods and then down the face of the hill right to the gates.
Yeah.
And I used to run that trail, and I used to beat my dad in his car down the thing. And it's interesting you say this because I would get down to the bottom of the hill, and he'd come around the corner and come down and so on. And it was sort of a tribute to me beating the car. And I was always suspicious as to whether he waited up the hill sufficiently long for me to get down the hill, you see. And he never admitted that. But you told me a story that you ran down the hill yourself, just like me. And they didn't wait for you. You beat them. Nobody waited for you to do that. So you told a little piece of history.
Yeah.
I used to, my dad used to sleep often in the afternoon on the weekend because he observed at night.
Yeah.
And I used to steal his keys from his pocket. And I went over to the observatory to open the door because there were tourists that came by. And I've never told anybody this, but you're all going to be dead in 20 years anyways. I'll be dead long before you. And I used to say to the tourists, would you like to see in the observatory? And of course they said, oh, yeah, sure. So I would open the door and they come in and I take them up the 2 sets of 16 stairs to the dome floor. Now in the 4 or 5 years before that time, I would be attending these lectures at the observatory on Saturday nights. Some of you may have come to the observatory to look through a telescope or to hear a talk. Well, I heard these talks for years and I memorized them. So when these tourists came in, I simply reeled off all of this and showed them all the inner secrets. And as they would leave and go down, one of the men or so would leave a little stack of 3 or 4 nickels or dimes on the stair as a tip. You know, this is my secret. I've never told anybody that, but I'll know now. Forgive me. So that's. But Mike, I'm really pleased to meet another human being that knows about that trail, because I doubt very many people even here knew about that trail or used that trail, you know, up and down. Doug Gate, who's a member, lived on the east side of the hill.
Yeah.
And he remembers that his parents, the mother, she said, I saw a car, dark car, going down the road behind their house up on the hill. And within an hour after that, one of the big fires blossomed. And he's always thought that somebody threw a cigarette out of the car going down the hill. And of course it was tinder brush, you see, and it would light. Well, no one could ever, you know that. Beside Doug Gate lived Ted Bolton and Elaine and Ted, Lauren, and Elaine.
Bolton.
Not every car, Bolton. Lauren, I think, became a judge. Lauren lived on one of the islands. So, but Doug is probably one of the oldest people in my life that I remember. Ian was in my class in Royal Oak, and several of the others I've brushed shoulders with. But thank you for your story.
As an aside, I wound up taking a course from Dr. Petrie's second wife, taking an astronomy course at UVic years later.
Jean Petrie. Here's Jean McDonald.
Jean, that's right,
Yeah, she came from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and came out to the observatory, and then she, after Carlotta died, Dr. Petrie's first wife, unfortunately, and my mother died before her, so you become a director and then your wife dies of cancer. It's just like tradition sort of now. But she died, and Jean became fond of Bert, and the two of them professionally were great astronomers.
Yeah.
And so they married. Really great. Jean became a friend long after that of the family. She had a sister, Rose, and they were in Parklands Manor off of Hillside, somewhere in there for a long time. She lived for a long time. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Another memory I have from living there is on a clear night, I can remember we could hear the dome being rotated. It was loud enough that you could hear down in the valley. You could hear the dome going around. Yeah.
Well, like I say, Robert was a bit of a screwball, and his dad had a DeSoto, big DeSoto car with a fluid drive. And his repair bills way back then must have been $300-400 a month. Robert was a maniac with him.
So any stories about wandering with friends or?
My mind's gone blank.
Yeah. Okay.
I heard one. A neighbor, Patsy Klottenberg. She said her and Mike and I think there was a couple other kids wandered off, and they went over to Cadoga Bay, went all over down Victoria, and then they ended up over in Esquimalt. They came.
Oh, yeah.
And she said she was about 10 and you were probably about 12 or 13.
Yeah.
And one of the neighbors was out looking for you guys and found you and said, "Do you know the police are looking for you guys?" They were gone. You were gone all day, she said.
Well, we used to hike from Viaduct Avenue across the fields, right up through here, and all the way up to Mount Doug.
Yeah.
And you could do that back then.
Yeah.
Not bother anybody. Yeah.
Do you have any stories with Butch Cleveland?
Well, Butch and I were good friends. They were in the same classes all the way through high school. Well, I left after grade 11. But I can't think of... Yeah, I can. I was coming back from Cordova Bay one night on my bike, and I'm coming down Brookley, and there's that sharp turn that goes up like that, and then it goes like that. And I come up and around, and there's Butch coming the other way in his car with Geraldine Miller, and I almost hit him head on. Yeah, Butch was a good friend. But other than stories, I can't think of any right now.
Do you remember the Williams family?
Pardon me?
Do you remember the Williams family up on Halliburton? Steve Williams?
Don't recall.
There was
Huh?
8 kids up there. Carol Williams. Sharon Williams.
Sharon Williams?
Yep.
Well, they lived down on Man Avenue at one time, or Lindsay Avenue.
Yeah, and they lived up in Halliburton as well.
Pardon me?
They lived up on Halliburton as well.
Right.
It's a little crazy too. His dad said to empty the pool. He took the tractor and he lifted the pool up and he flooded everything out. It was a crazy family.
Well, we were all kind of crazy, but we didn't do damage. We didn't damage stuff. We didn't hurt people.
Yeah.
We raised a lot of hell that none of us wound up in jail.
Okay. So Mike, just to finish up today, any thoughts about growing up that you'd like to pass along?
Well, it was a wonderful place to grow up. And it was rural. And at that time, like I used to go hunting all the time. I had a .22 caliber air rifle, and I used to wander the hills by myself a lot and wander the woods. And I used to think of kids I knew downtown. I always called them city kids. They were so different than what we were used to out here. And I invited them, one of them to stay over one night, and the next morning I took them hunting. And we're just walking up through the property. You know where it was leveled there, about part way up? We're just up at that level spot, and a pheasant flew over and landed in the bush. And I put a pellet in my gun, went in there after it, and it flew up right in front of me. And it scared the hell out of me. You know what it's like when they fly up like that. And I went bang, shot him right through the head. That impressed the city kid.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing your stories with us, and thanks to the people too who
contributed, yeah.
Yeah, who have contributed as well. Thank you very much.